Anybody did not receive the final examination, please indicate by putting on a frowning face. Okay, that's good. My assumption then is that everybody.
Well, let's do a reverse. Can everybody make a smiley face that you have received it?
Recording stopped.
Any particular reason? That the recording stopped?
No, it's this program, not that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they all received it.
Okay, fine. All right. Very good. We'll start in just about 1 minute.
Is the sound and video okay for everybody?
There's still about 9 people.
Yep, you're all happy with that. Okay, good. Once again, today's lecture will be up on YouTube and you'll receive a link in approximately 24 hours. The professor says that it will be up until just after the exam?
Yes.
Just after the exam. After that, it will...
No, after the end of the week.
Sorry, after the end of the week. After that, it will no longer be available. So, catch this week's, last week's and the week before's lectures whilst you can.
All right, there's still a number of people missing, but I think we'll get started. Thank you, Shimon.
You're good. I think you're good to go. Recording.
Okay, you can ask.
Yeah. Door open or closed?
Close it. Again, good afternoon. You all received the final exam. I look forward to getting your responses by Friday. And I must say that unlike the usual situation with the final exam, I really look forward to seeing what you're going to write. We're going to start today, as we have for the last 2 or 3 weeks, with questions that members of the class sent in after the session of last Monday. One of these were some very good questions, incidentally, which I've taken out 3 to address to the entire class. The first had to do with my discussion of the budgetary process last week, which one of the students felt was a bit rushed, and I didn't give enough time to it, and he needed certain elements needed clarification. So I will start with that today. The budgetary process in the United States government, as I mentioned before, is extremely complex and extremely chaotic. And at every step of the way, the various institutions, agencies, and departments that are involved in preparing the budget are subject to lobbying by outside interest groups. I did mention that the various departments and agencies of government send the Office of Management and Budget in the Office of the Executive Office of the President their requests for the next fiscal year. In the United States, the fiscal year starts on October 1st. The budget is supposed to be in place by October 1st. It almost never is. And we'll be seeing, as we discuss the budgetary process, why that is. In any case, the agencies and departments of government send their requests into the Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget crafts an overall budget for the government for the following fiscal year and sends it to the President for his approval. Once the President has approved it, he sends it to Congress. In Congress, the Senate and the House then consider every one of the requests or the budgets of the various departments and agencies of government separately in 12 subcommittees, first of the budget committees of the House and the Senate, which then pass a resolution once they've gone through this entire process of making changes and negotiating and being lobbied and so on and so forth, all of which takes many, many weeks. They then send it to the Budget Committee as a whole, and the Budget Committee in the House and the Senate pass their authorizations. An authorization is not an appropriation. No money is committed at that point. As a matter of fact, it's simply a guideline. Also, the House, what the House passes will be different, inevitably, to what the Senate passes, so they have to send it to a conference committee, which will attempt to change both versions and make them into a single version, which then goes to the full House and the full Senate to be approved. At that point, that goes then to the appropriations committees of the House and the Senate, and the subcommittees of the appropriations committees go through the same process that the subcommittees of the budget committees went through before, and they again will be heavily lobbied by the agencies of government as well as by outside groups as they are considering the actual appropriations of funds for this purpose. Because the Constitution says that all money bills must start in the House has to pass its version of the appropriations before the Senate can consider its. Again, the two versions will be different. So again, the House and the Senate have to form a conference committee which is going to try to put it all together and come up with a single document. While all of that's going on, very heavy lobbying is taking place. There are negotiations going on all over the place among the senators, among the representatives, with their home states, with their home districts, with the other people within their own party, with members of the other party, and with outside trade groups, environmental groups, all professional groups, all kinds of lobbying groups that will be lobbying directly or through their representatives and senators in the Congress. When all of that is finally settled, a single budget will then go to the president for the president to sign. Once the president has signed it, he can of course veto it, but once the president has signed it, it is then law, and it is the budget for the following fiscal year. It is actually the budget for the current fiscal year because there will have been no budget at the end of the previous fiscal year on September 30th. I hope this isn't getting too confusing. So when the final bill goes to the budget bill goes to the president, it might be January, it might be February, it might be March, and as a result, it covers the fiscal year October 1st of one year to September 30th of the following year. But in fact, that's theoretically and by law, but in fact it will go through, almost certainly go through substantially into the following fiscal year as a result of a continuing resolution. A continuing resolution simply says that since we haven't been able to come up with a budget in the statutory time when we're supposed to do so, the previous year's budget will simply continue for the time being. And that almost always happens. Just one final comment, and that is a supplementary appropriation. During the fiscal year, let's say some crisis happens, a domestic crisis, an international crisis, and one of the agencies or departments of government finds that it must do things that are going to cost a lot more money than was in the budget, it will then go to the appropriations committees of the House and the Senate to pass a supplementary budget, and hopefully if they do so, and they may have differences also and may have to go to a conference committee, eventually it will be sent to the president for his signature, and then the supplementary budget will be applied to that particular agency or department of the government. I hope that helps. It leads directly into another, this wasn't really a question, it was a suggestion on the part of one of the students, and that is that I should devote some time, particularly since I've been in the government twice, I would devote some time to how the United States government makes economic policy. Clearly, part of that is the budgetary process, which we've already gone through. What money is available, what money is spent, is obviously part of economic policy as carried out by the U.S. government. But in terms of policy as opposed to process and as opposed to resources, how you raise the money, how you spend the money, as opposed to resources and process, the formation of policy is also a complex matter. A policy in the economic sphere having to do with either domestic economic policy or international economic policy begins in the White House, although it can be, of course, suggested by any one of the departments of government. It will go, if it has to do with the with international economic policy, to the Economic Council and to the National Security Council. And there is a member of the National Security Council that attends Economic Council meetings and a member of the Economic Council that attends National Security Council meetings when economic subjects are under discussion. The Economic Council, of course, also has a relationship with the Domestic Council, and it has the same kind of interchange of personnel. So, the agencies of the Executive Office of the President will probably, if it's an important matter, they will convene an interagency group, or if it's a very important matter of economic policy, a senior interagency group, an IG or a SIG, and that, of course, means that every department and agency of government, as well as the departments of the Executive Office of the President, will meet to hash out the policy. These the interagency groups are generally chaired by someone from the White House, from the National Security Council, or from the Economic Council or the Domestic Council. Senior interagency groups tend to be chaired by the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Commerce or the Secretary of the Treasury, or in other words, a cabinet secretary as opposed to a member of the White House bureaucracy. Also, lobbying goes on. Lobbying goes on from the government, within the federal government. Lobbying goes on by the states and localities. Lobbying goes on by private lobbying groups in the society at large throughout this entire process. At this point, however, the lobbying is entirely with the executive branch. The White House will be lobbied. The departments involved in this particular decision, policy decision, will be also lobbied. So, the interagency group or senior interagency group will come up with a policy. Generally, it is preferred that it be by consensus, but if necessary, it is by majority. And, of course, it is then sent to the President, who has the final word, and he will probably invoke a formal meeting of the National Security Council or the Economic Council or the Domestic Council with all the representatives of the great agencies and departments of government attending, and then he will make his decision as to what the policy is going to be. At that point, of course, then, having decided on the policy, the decision has to be made how to carry out the policy. And while policy is made basically in the White House, these policies are carried out by the departments and agencies of the federal government, and in many cases also by state and local government agencies and departments who are delegated certain responsibilities in terms of carrying out certain policies. This gets the Congress involved again. The Congress is involved in raising the funds and allocating those funds with reference to the particular policy that is involved. There are very few policy decisions that don't involve or don't have to involve congressional action. Now, because this is such a long process, because it is such a chaotic process, there is a tremendous incentive, temptation on the part of the executive office of the president himself, to attempt to carry out policy without going to the Congress for any kind of action. There is a tremendous incentive also to try to carry out policies from within the White House rather than through the great departments, because these departments have their own internal policies and they have their own constituencies. The constituency of the Department of Labor is the labor movement. The constituency of the Department of Commerce is the business community. The constituency of the Treasury Department are the great financial institutions of the country, etc., etc., etc. And the State Department will be involved because every decision in international economic policy has foreign policy implications. And so they will also get involved, certainly in every important policy decision of international economic policy, and in certain domestic policy and economic policy decisions also. The Department of Homeland Security will get involved, or may get involved, depending on what the subject is. The Defense Department will certainly get involved, depending again on the subject of the policy decision, and that's both with reference to domestic policy and with reference to foreign or international economic policy. The temptation to try to bypass all of this is enormous. Obviously, both the Congress on the one hand and the departments of government on the other hand defend their turf like a mother tiger defends its cubs. So this is not easy for the executive office of the president, for the president to carry out. I have to say that current administration, the Obama administration, has done this to a greater extent than any previous administration, and there are something like 34 so-called czars in the executive office of the president. These are people who are in charge of various policy areas and are not subject to confirmation by the Senate, as are the department heads and other high officials. In any case, there is an obvious bypassing of the departments by having so many of these czars in the White House, and there is an obvious attempt to bypass the Congress with reference to certain policy decisions, including shifting budgetary allocations within departments, within the State Department, within the Commerce Department, within other departments, doing it by executive action rather than going back to the Congress for authorization to do so. Whether all of this is legal and constitutional is questionable. President Obama has been getting away with it, and I have no reason to believe that he won't continue to do this during the second term, since he got away with it during his first term. I have to say that both the policy-making machinery of government and that's with reference to economic policy as well as to all other kinds of policy, and the machinery of the budgetary process are so chaotic and anarchic and so subject to outside influence and pressure that, you know, if I were president of the United States, which God forbid, I would have the same temptation. I would have the same temptation. At any rate, I hope this has at least given you a very quick overview of how economic policy is made in the U.S. government. Okay, a student asked a very good question, saying that I had gone through a discussion of money and a discussion of financial institutions, and in the syllabus it talks about that I'm going to talk about, it says that I'm going to talk about interest, and it certainly does, and I did not, and I apologize for that, and I'm going to do that now. Interest, in the simplest way of putting it, interest is the price of money. It is subject to the same laws of supply and demand as any other commodity or service. If the demand is high, the supply is low, the interest rate will be high because it's the price of money. If there is a plentiful supply of credit and a low demand for credit, the price will be low. That means the interest rate will be low. Again, as with everything else we've discussed throughout the course, that's the theory. The reality tends to be somewhat different, particularly with reference to interest rates, as with reference to the application of the laws of supply and demand to other commodities, where governments get involved in trying to set prices, to provide subsidies and so on, as we discussed in previous classes. The government also gets involved in interfering with the setting of interest rates by the market. And that is done largely by the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System is the central bank of the United States. The Federal Reserve System was established early in the 20th century as an attempt to prevent financial crises from taking place, with many bank failures and runs on banks and so on and so forth, which had taken place prior to the establishment of a central bank. The United States was one of the last countries in the world to establish a central bank, and when it did so in good U.S. federal fashion, and it did so in such a way that it was a phantasmagoric mess. Because it's not a bank, it's a system, and that's why it's called the Federal Reserve System. And there are actually 12 Federal Reserve banks. They are regional banks. They cover various regions of the country. There's one in Boston, there's one in New York, there's one in Atlanta, there's one in Chicago, there's one in San Francisco, etc., etc. Each one of these regional banks